They gave her a name whispered on encrypted channels, a name like a ghost story told around flickering data screens in hardened bunkers deep beneath the earth. They called her Voronova, the one who solved impossible equations written in ridgelines and kill zones. He, the Major, saw only a woman, small and silent, a gray anomaly against the stark white of the Arctic Circle. He saw a problem of insubordination, a disruption to his command. He learned, in the echoing silence of a shattered mountain, that he had never understood the equation at all. He was merely one of its variables, and she was the one who solved it. The silence of forward operating base Kestrel was a physical weight. It was a pressure composed of cold, of altitude, and of the immense, indifferent geology that surrounded them. The base was a raw scrape of steel and insulated fabric gouged into the flank of the Tartarus Range, a place where the planet's bones jutted through its frozen skin like the ribs of a starved beast. Air here was thin and sharp, a blade in the lungs with every breath. It carried no scent but the sterile bite of ice and the faint metallic tang of diesel from the generators that fought a losing war against the encroaching frost. For Dr. Anya Voronova, the silence was not empty. It was a medium, rich with data. She stood at the edge of the perimeter, a small figure bundled in gray thermal composites, her face obscured by the wrap and goggles that protected her from the vicious wind. She was not looking at the wire or the automated sentry guns. Her gaze was fixed on the opposite wall of the canyon, a sheer cliff face of Precambrian gneiss shot through with veins of darker, angrier schist. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky just before the sun dies, were not merely seeing rock. They were reading a history billions of years old, a story of tectonic violence and glacial patience. She traced the fracture lines, the shear zones where the rock had failed under unimaginable stress. She noted the exfoliation, the way the outer layers were peeling away like onion skin under the relentless cycle of freezing and thawing. With a gloved hand, she picked up a piece of scree from the ground. The texture was rough, crystalline. She could feel the granular structure, the way the mica flakes caught the flat, gray light. In her mind, a complex model was building itself, a three-dimensional map of geological weaknesses, of resonant frequencies, of potential energy waiting for a catalyst. The wind, a constant whining presence, was another layer of that model. It was not a uniform force. It eddied and swirled, compressed by the canyon walls into invisible rivers and vortexes. She could feel its pressure changes on her exposed cheeks, could see its path in the way it sculpted the snowdrifts against the containers. It was a variable in a ballistic equation that had not yet been written. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the atmosphere was different. The silence there was not natural. It was the tense, coiled quiet of men waiting for something to break. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, ozone from the servers, and the low hum of anxiety. Maps and satellite overlays glowed on the primary screens, the frozen canyon designated as Objective Serpent. It was a 5-kilometer stretch of impassable terrain, the only viable route for the armored convoy that was currently stalled 30 kilometers to the south. And in the center of that canyon, the enemy had dug in. They were ghosts, phantoms who had used the terrain to make themselves invisible to thermal, to satellite, to every conventional method of detection. The last scout team sent to probe their defenses had simply vanished. Not a single radio transmission, just silence. Major Kalin dominated the room, not by his physical size, though he was a large man, but by the sheer force of his presence. He was a creature of straight lines and right angles, his uniform impeccable, his jaw set like a clamp. He moved with a restless energy, pacing before the screens, his boots striking the metal floor with sharp, authoritative reports. He was a man who believed in overwhelming force, in the pure and simple application of mass and velocity. The canyon was a problem to be solved with explosives, a knot to be cut with the sword of conventional warfare. His worldview was a blunt instrument, and he swung it with absolute confidence. His eyes, chips of hard, angry blue, swept the room and settled on the empty chair. "Where is the specialist?" he demanded, his voice a low growl that cut through the humming quiet. Sergeant Reese, the comms NCO, stiffened slightly. He was a competent man, his movements economical, his gaze steady. He respected the chain of command, but he also recognized the scent of impending disaster. "Dr. Voronova is outside, sir, observing the terrain." Kalen scoffed, a sound like grinding rocks. "Observing the terrain. We have drones that can do that. We have ground-penetrating radar. Get her in here, now." He turned back to the map, stabbing a thick finger at the center of the canyon. "The plan is simple. We can't see them, so we'll flush them out. A rolling barrage, starting from grid 0-4-1 and walking its way up the canyon floor. High explosive. We'll turn that entire stretch of ice and rock into a glass parking lot. Once the barrage is complete, Task Force Bravo will push through with armor and clear any remaining resistance." A junior lieutenant, his face pale with a mixture of fear and duty, cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, the preliminary geological survey suggested the canyon walls are unstable. A sustained artillery barrage could trigger significant rock slides. It could block the route completely." Kalen's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing. "Are you a demolitions expert, Lieutenant? Are you a geologist?" "No, sir, but the report." "The report was written by academics in a lab 1,000 miles from here," Kalen cut him off. "I am the commander on the ground. My orders stand. We hit them. We hit them hard, and we push through. Is that clear?" The room answered with a tense, collective silence that he took for assent. It was the silence of men who knew a bad order when they heard one, but lacked the rank to question it. Just then, the hatch to the TOC hissed open, and Anya Voronova stepped inside. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her small frame seeming to absorb the sound around her. She unzipped her outer layer, revealing a simple, dark gray uniform, devoid of any rank or insignia. She pulled off her goggles, and for the first time, the men in the room saw her eyes. They were unsettlingly calm, ancient, and analytical. She carried the cold in with her, a palpable aura of the world outside the heated container. Kalen turned on her, his posture aggressive. He saw her as the embodiment of the caution and complexity he despised. "Dr. Voronova, glad you could join us. We were just finalizing the operational parameters for clearing the Serpent. Or were you too busy with your observations?" The condescension in his voice was thick enough to taste. Anya's gaze drifted from Kalen to the main screen, her eyes scanning the topographical data, the thermal overlays, the failed sensor sweeps. Her expression remained neutral, a mask of placid concentration. She was processing, collating the data from her direct observations with the information on the screens. She saw the lie in the thermal imaging, the way certain rock faces seemed to absorb and radiate heat in patterns that defied natural geology. They were using insulated panels, perfectly matched to the thermal signature of the surrounding rock. Clever. She saw the dead zones in the radio spectrum, places where the canyon's geometry created natural Faraday cages. Also clever. They knew the terrain as well as she did, maybe better. "Major," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying an odd resonance in the hushed room. It was not a voice of command, but of fact. "Your plan will fail." The air in the Tosi solidified. Every man stopped breathing. Kalen's face, already flushed with authority, darkened to a dangerous shade of crimson. He took a step toward her, his large frame looming over her smaller one. He was used to being obeyed, to his presence intimidating lesser men into submission. He expected her to flinch, to stammer, to retreat. She did not. She stood her ground, her gaze unwavering, her posture relaxed. It was the calm of a master craftsman observing a clumsy apprentice. "And what exactly," Kalen said, his voice dangerously low, "gives you the authority to make that assessment, Doctor? You are a civilian attachment, a consultant. You are here to advise, not to countermand a direct operational order." Anya's eyes flickered back to the screen, to a specific section of the canyon wall she had been studying for the past 3 hours. "The enemy is not on the canyon floor," she stated simply. "They are embedded in the north-facing wall, behind the exfoliation layers of the gneiss. They have excavated shallow positions using the natural fractures. Your artillery will be ineffective. The angle of attack is too steep. The shells will either detonate against the outer rock face, causing superficial damage, or they will be airbursts, equally useless. The only thing your barrage will accomplish is destabilizing the hanging wall rock mass at grid 0-4-3. The seismic shock will propagate through the schist layer, which has a low shear strength, particularly at these temperatures. You will trigger a catastrophic rock slide, burying the canyon floor under 100,000 tons of debris. You will not kill a single enemy soldier, and you will trap the convoy on this side of the mountains until the spring thaw. She delivered the analysis without emotion, as if reading a weather report. It was a chain of cause and effect, a simple, brutal equation. For Kalen, it was an intolerable act of public defiance. He saw her not as an expert, but as a saboteur of his authority. "That is a theory," he spat, his fists clenching at his sides. "A guess based on your observations. I am a soldier. I operate on actionable intelligence and proven tactics, and my tactic is overwhelming firepower." He turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "Sergeant Reese, begin the targeting sequence for the artillery. I want the first shells on their way in 10 minutes. Sergeant Reese hesitated for a fraction of a second. His eyes met Anya's. He saw no anger in her expression, no fear, no frustration. He saw only a quiet certainty, the absolute confidence of someone who had already seen the future and was merely waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. He looked at Kalen's rigid, furious back. He looked at the concerned faces of the other men. Then, with a quiet sigh of resignation, he turned to his console. "Yes, sir," Reese said, his voice flat. The chain of command was absolute, and it was leading them, he knew with a cold certainty, directly into disaster. Anya Voronova did not argue further. She simply moved to a small, unoccupied corner of the Tios, sat down at an auxiliary console, and began pulling up raw data feeds. She requested the detailed spectrographic analysis of the canyon rock from the last orbital pass, the hour-by-hour barometric pressure logs, and the high-resolution seismic data from the regional network. She ignored the flurry of activity as the gun crews were put on alert. She ignored the palpable tension that filled the room. She was no longer part of their world of orders and protocol. She had retreated into her own, a world of pure physics, of numbers and vectors and stress mechanics. She was building her own solution, waiting for the majors to fail. The first shell was a distant, guttural cough that vibrated through the floor of the TOC. On the main screen, a camera feed from a drone hovering high above the canyon showed a flash of orange and a puff of black smoke against the gray rock face. Then another, and another. The rolling barrage had begun. Kalen stood with his arms crossed, a grimly satisfied smirk on his face, watching the screen as if it were a fireworks display. He was a man watching his will being imposed upon the landscape. Anya did not watch the screen. She watched her own console, where a graph was plotting the seismic vibrations picked up by her sensors. She saw the initial spikes as the high explosive shells impacted. They were sharp, violent, but shallow. They barely registered on the deeper geophones, just as she predicted. The energy was dissipating on the surface, shattering the outer layers of rock, but not penetrating to the core. She saw the feedback from the acoustic sensors she had placed along the perimeter. The sound of the explosions was being strangely muffled and distorted by the canyon, lensing and echoing in ways that scrambled any attempt at directional analysis. The enemy was using the mountain not just as a shield, but as a tool of deception. The barrage continued for 20 minutes, a relentless, deafening drumbeat of failed violence. The drone feed showed a canyon floor choked with smoke and dust, the rock walls pockmarked and blackened. It looked like hell. To Kalen, it looked like victory. "Barrage complete," he announced, his voice ringing with triumph. "Send in Bravo. I want a full sweep. Report back when the area is secure." Sergeant Reese relayed the order, his face a mask of professionalism that concealed a deep-seated dread. On the screen, the icons for the two lead armored personnel carriers of Task Force Bravo began to move, creeping into the mouth of the serpent. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the crackle of static and the low rumble of their engines. The carriers advanced slowly, cautiously, their gunners scanning the smoke-shrouded cliffs. Then the radio screamed. It was not a clean tactical report. It was a burst of pure animal panic. "Contact! Contact! North wall! They're everywhere! We can't see them! Oh God, engine hit! We're immobilized!" The transmission was cut short by a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of metal in half. The icon for the lead APC flashed red, then went dark. A second voice came on, higher, tighter. "RPG, from above! We can't elevate high enough! Pulling back! Pulling—" That transmission also died, replaced by a piercing electronic squeal. The second icon winked out. Silence. The crisis had arrived, swift and brutal. Kalen's face had gone slack, the triumphant flush replaced by a waxy, chalk-white pallor. He stared at the screen, at the two dead icons, his mind unable to process the speed and totality of his failure. His plan, his overwhelming force, had been swatted aside like an insect. What happened?" he stammered, the blunt instrument of his authority suddenly shattered. "Where did they come from?" "They were always there," Anya's voice cut through the shocked silence. She stood up from her console and walked to the main screen. With a few keystrokes on the control panel, she brought up her own data. She overlaid the thermal imaging with a geological stress map and the acoustic sensor data. They waited for the barrage to end. They waited for your armor to enter the primary kill zone, the point where the canyon's acoustics create the most confusion and the line of sight is most restricted. They are in the positions I indicated. She pointed to a series of almost imperceptible shadows on the north wall, places the drone camera had passed over 100 times without seeing anything. Now, with her data providing context, they looked like what they were: concealed firing ports, perfectly blended into the rock. Kalen's shock was rapidly being replaced by a seething defensive fury. He needed a target for his rage, a scapegoat for his catastrophic miscalculation. "You knew," he accused, his voice trembling. "You sat there and let my men drive into a death trap." "I told you your plan would fail, Major," Anya replied, her voice still devoid of any emotion. It was this calm, this absolute lack of passion, that seemed to enrage him the most. "You chose not to listen. Your methods have failed. The result is 2 lost vehicles and at least 10 casualties. Continuing on your present course will only increase that number." "Then what do you suggest, Doctor?" Kalen sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Should we ask them to come out nicely? Should we throw rocks at them?" "No," she said. "I will remove them." The statement hung in the air, audacious in its simplicity. Kalen stared at her, a laugh of pure disbelief bubbling in his throat. "You? You will remove them with what? Your theories, your charts?" Anya turned to Sergeant Reese, who had been watching the exchange with a kind of horrified fascination. Her gaze was direct, her focus absolute. For the first time, she issued not a statement of fact, but a quiet command. "Sergeant, I need my rifle, and the M903 SLAPT rounds, the ones with the tungsten carbide penetrators. Bring them to Observation Post Delta. I also need a direct comms link and a real-time feed from the drone, focused on the coordinates I am sending to your console now." Reese looked from her to the Major. He saw the future in her eyes and the past in Kalen's. He made his choice. It was the end of his career, perhaps, or the beginning of something else entirely. "Right away, ma'am," he said, turning to his station without waiting for the Major's permission. This was it, the moment of fracture, the point where the formal hierarchy of rank shattered against the undeniable hierarchy of competence. Kalen sputtered, his face contorted with rage. "Sergeant, you will stand down! You take your orders from me! I am in command here!" Reese paused, his hand over the comm switch. He looked at the Major, his expression one of polite, professional regret. "Sir, with all due respect, your command just got 10 men killed. Her analysis was correct. I'm following the only viable option left to us." He keyed the mic. "Harkin, this is Reese. Get Dr. Varanova's case to OP Delta on the double, and I mean now." The rest of the TOC staff froze, watching the silent coup unfold. Authority did not need to be seized from Kalen. It simply evaporated from him, leaving behind a hollow shell of rank and fury. It flowed across the room and condensed around the small, gray figure of the woman who had predicted everything. She did not seem to notice. She was already walking toward the hatch, her mind focused on the next phase of the equation. Now, Observation Post Delta was little more than a fortified hole dug into the ridgeline overlooking the frozen canyon. It offered a commanding view of the entire serpent, a God's eye perspective on the problem below. The wind was a physical blow-up here, a shrieking, relentless force that clawed at her clothing and tried to steal the air from her lungs. Anya lay prone on a thermal mat, impervious to the cold that seeped from the frozen earth. Before her sat a rifle that looked more like a piece of scientific instrumentation than a weapon of war. It was a custom-built, heavily modified .50 caliber chassis, its barrel shrouded in a carbon fiber heatsink, its stock a minimalist skeleton of titanium. The optics mounted on top were the size of a small telescope, with dials and readouts that glowed with faint green light. Sergeant Reese lay beside her, manning a ruggedized tablet that displayed the drone feed. He had brought 2 other soldiers with him, men he trusted. They formed a silent, protective perimeter, their faces grim. They were all witnesses to an act of profound insubordination, and they had all, wordlessly, chosen their side. Down in the talk, Major Kalin was likely screaming into a radio, demanding their arrest. But up here, on the roof of the world, his authority was a faint, irrelevant noise. The only thing that mattered was the problem in the canyon and the woman who claimed she could solve it. Anya worked with a methodical, unhurried grace. Her movements were precise, efficient, stripped of all wasted motion. She chambered one of the specialized rounds Reese had brought. It was a monstrous thing, long and slender, its tip a dark, malevolent gray. A sabbated light armor penetrator, tracer, designed to punch through the engine blocks of armored vehicles. But she had no intention of hitting a vehicle. "Feed is live, ma'am," Reese said, his voice tight. "Drone is holding station at your designated coordinates. I'm looking at a rock wall." "That is correct, Sergeant," Anya replied, her eye pressed to the optic. Her voice was a low murmur, almost a whisper, yet it carried clearly over the wind. "Zoom in, grid 0 to 4 to 3.7. Follow the primary shear zone up from the base." Reese manipulated the controls, and the image on the tablet magnified. He saw what looked like an unremarkable stretch of cliff face, blackened and scarred from the earlier artillery barrage. "I don't see anything." "You are not looking for a target," Anya explained patiently. "You are looking for a fulcrum." Through her own optics, the world was transformed into a landscape of data. The scope did not just magnify, it analyzed. A laser rangefinder pulsed, giving her a distance to the target of 2,841 meters. An onboard computer was calculating the variables: temperature, minus 37 degrees Celsius, barometric pressure, 610 millibars, humidity, 4%, wind, gusting from 270 degrees at 15 meters per second. She input the muzzle velocity of the specific ammunition lot she was using and the rotational drift of the bullet. The Coriolis effect at this latitude, over this distance, would pull the round almost a full meter to the left. All of these were simple calculations, the basic catechism of extreme long-range marksmanship, but they were only the first layer. The real work was in the geology. She was not aiming at a point on the surface. She was aiming at a point deep inside the rock. Her target was a keystone, a specific formation of quartz-rich granite that was acting as a plug, holding a massive, unstable slab of the hanging wall in place. The artillery had shaken it, weakened the surrounding schist, but it had failed to deliver the right kind of energy. High explosive was like a hammer blow, loud, dramatic, but unfocused. She needed a scalpel. She needed to deliver a precise, kinetic shock directly to the internal fracture point she had identified. She adjusted the elevation dial on her scope, the clicks audible and sharp in the thin air. She took a breath, held it, and let half of it out. Her heart rate, monitored by a sensor in her glove, slowed to a steady 45 beats per minute. The world narrowed to the circle of her scope, the crosshairs, and the point on the rock that existed only in her calculations. She was not a soldier about to take a life. She was a physicist about to conduct an experiment. The canyon was her laboratory. The rifle was her particle accelerator. "This is not a shot," she murmured, more to herself than to Reese. "This is a key." She applied pressure to the trigger. It was a two-stage pull, clean and crisp. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a solid, brutal shove. The report was a sharp, flat crack that was instantly snatched away by the wind. For a moment, nothing happened. The drone feed showed a tiny puff of dust on the rock face, a minuscule chip disappearing from the cliff. It was an anticlimax. Down in the talk, Kaylin, who had been watching a relayed feed, let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Is that it? That's her master plan? She's throwing pebbles. I want that woman arrested now." But Reese, lying next to her, felt it first. A low, deep hum that vibrated up from the bedrock, through the mat, and into his bones. It was a frequency too low to be heard, but it could be felt. On the tablet, the drone's camera began to tremble. Anya had already chambered a second round. Her eyes had never left the scope. "Wait for it," she whispered. The hum grew into a grinding groan. A thin, dark line appeared on the cliff face, a crack spreading out from the point of impact like a spider web on glass. It grew with terrifying speed, branching and forking. The sound arrived a moment later, a deep, resonant tearing, the sound of a mountain coming apart. "My God," Reese breathed, staring at his screen. The entire section of the cliff face, a slab of rock the size of a naval destroyer, seemed to shift. It moved slowly at first, a ponderous geological shrug. Then, with a final deafening crack that echoed like the clap of doom, it gave way. It did not fall. It slid. 100,000 tons of gneiss and schist, liberated from its ancient moorings, descended upon the concealed enemy positions in a slow-motion avalanche of pure kinetic fury. It was not an explosion. It was an erasure. The rock face was scoured clean, the concealed bunkers and firing ports obliterated, buried under an unstoppable tide of stone. The avalanche thundered down the cliff, hit the canyon floor, and continued across, a wave of churning rock and ice that finally came to a rest against the opposite wall. The sound slowly faded, replaced by the settling groans of the rock and the continued shriek of the wind. Then silence. A profound, absolute silence that was deeper and heavier than before. The threat was gone, not neutralized, not suppressed. It was simply gone, as if it had never existed. The canyon was clear, but it was also impassable, just as she had predicted Kaylin's plan would have made it. Except this blockage was on her terms. The convoy couldn't pass, but neither could the enemy. She had created a new, permanent feature of the landscape, a tombstone. Anya pulled her eye back from the scope. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction. She simply felt the quiet completion of a task. The equation was solved. She began the methodical process of clearing her rifle, her movements as calm and deliberate as they had been before the shot. Reese stared at her, his face a mixture of awe and something that bordered on fear. He had seen men do incredible things with rifles. He had never seen anyone use one to command a mountain. How did you know?" he finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "Harmonic resonance," she said simply, packing a lens cloth back into her kit. The first shot was a percussive strike. It introduced a specific vibrational frequency into the rock mass. The internal structure of that particular granite formation was susceptible to that frequency. It began to resonate like a tuning fork. The vibrations propagated through the weaker schist layers, breaking the crystalline bonds that held it all together. It was already under immense stress. I just gave it a reason to fail. She looked at him, her winter sky eyes holding his for a moment. I did not break the mountain, Sergeant. I just showed it where it was already broken. The comms unit on his belt crackled to life. It was not Kalen's enraged shouting. It was a calm, controlled voice, one that carried the effortless authority of high command. It was a voice that Reese had only ever heard in system-wide briefings. Observation Post Delta, this is General Thorne. Come in. Reese scrambled to answer, his professionalism snapping back into place. General, this is Sergeant Reese. I read you 5 by 5. I have Major Kalen here, Sergeant, the voice said, and Reese could almost hear the Arctic chill in the general's tone. He has been making some extraordinary claims. He says a civilian consultant has taken de facto command of his FOB and triggered a massive rock slide in the operational area. Is that an accurate assessment of the situation? Reese looked at Anya, who was now standing, gazing out at the altered landscape. Yes, General, he said, his voice firm. That is an accurate assessment. There was a pause on the other end. Reese could hear a muffled, furious voice in the background. Kalen, undoubtedly trying to plead his case. Then the general's voice returned, colder than ever. Sergeant, put Dr. Voronova on. Reese held the handset out to her. She took it without a word. This is Voronova, she said. Spectre, the general's voice replied, and the change was immediate. The formality was gone, replaced by a tone of weary familiarity. The use of the call sign was a thunderclap in the quiet of the observation post. Reese's eyes went wide. Spectre. He knew that name. Everyone knew that name. It wasn't a person. It was a ghost story. A legend whispered about the operator who had collapsed the Tavanbog tunnel network with a single rifle shot. The one who had predicted and neutralized the volcanic eruption that would have wiped out a covert listening post in the Aleutians. Spectre wasn't real. It was a myth. The situation is contained, General, Anya said, her voice still a flat monotone. The immediate threat has been neutralized. However, Objective Serpent is now impassable to all ground traffic. The convoy will require an alternative route. Understood, General Thorne replied. Your solution was unorthodox, but effective. I've reviewed your pre-action analysis. It seems you gave the Major every opportunity to avoid this outcome. He is a blunt instrument, General, Anya stated. The problem required a scalpel. Indeed, Thorne said. Major Kalen is hereby relieved of command, effective immediately. He will be confined to his quarters, pending a full inquiry. I'm placing you, Sergeant Reese, the general added, his voice shifting back to a formal command tone. In temporary command of FOB Kestrel until a replacement arrives. Your actions today, while outside the formal chain of command, demonstrated a clear understanding of a commander's primary responsibility, mission success and the preservation of his soldiers. You chose competence over protocol. The record will reflect that. Sir, yes, sir. Thank you, sir, Reese stammered, completely stunned. Spectre, the general said, his voice softening again. Your transport is being rerouted. It will be on the ground in 2 hours. Your work here is done. Acknowledged, Anya said, and handed the handset back to Reese. The reckoning was complete. It had been swift, decisive, and utterly without ceremony. The arrogant authority had been humbled, his career likely finished. The observant subordinate had been vindicated and promoted, and the ghost was preparing to disappear once more. The journey back down from the observation post was made in silence. The wind still howled, but the oppressive tension that had gripped the base was gone, replaced by a stunned, quiet awe. When Anya entered the talk, the dozen men still on duty fell silent. They looked at her not as a woman, not as a civilian, but as something other. A force of nature, perhaps, like the cold or the mountain itself. Major Kalin was gone, already escorted to his quarters by two grim-faced military policemen who had seemed to appear from nowhere. The room felt larger without his furious energy filling it. Anya went back to her corner, retrieved a small, ruggedized data pad from her pack, and began compiling her after-action report. She worked with the same focused intensity she had displayed on the ridge, her fingers flying across the virtual keyboard. She cataloged the seismic data, the ballistic calculations, the precise tonnage of displaced rock, and the final state of the objective area. It was a report written in the cold, hard language of physics, a final, irrefutable testament to the events of the last hour. Sergeant, now acting commander, Reese watched her for a long moment. The men looked to him for orders, for guidance in this strange new reality. He cleared his throat, his voice finding a new and unfamiliar note of command. "Get me a full damage assessment from the canyon. I want a drone mapping the new debris field, and get the convoy command on the line. We need to start planning a new route through the highlands. It'll be longer, but it's our only option now." The men, grateful for the return to familiar routine, jumped to their tasks. A new order had been established, one based not on the volume of a man's voice or the insignia on his collar, but on the quiet, demonstrable fact of competence. The base was still a lonely frozen outpost, but it was no longer a dysfunctional one. Later, as the strange perpetual twilight of the Arctic winter settled over the base, Reese approached her. He held out a steaming, insulated mug. She looked up from her datapad, her eyes focusing on him slowly, as if returning from a great distance. "Coffee," he said. It was not a question. She took it, her gloved fingers wrapping around the warm metal. "Thank you, Sergeant." "It's Reese, ma'am, and I'm in command now, apparently." He shook his head, a small, disbelieving smile touching his lips. He leaned against the console beside her, the formal barrier between them seemingly dissolved. "I have to ask. I saw the shot. I saw the result. But I don't understand it. Not really. The harmonic resonance. Is that something they teach at sniper school?" Anya took a slow sip of the coffee. The warmth was a pleasant, grounding sensation. "No," she said. "They teach it in advanced geophysics." Reese stared into his own mug. "You're not a sniper, are you?" "I am a tool," she replied, her gaze distant again, looking through the steel walls of the talk and out at the mountains beyond. "A tool that is applied to problems that cannot be solved by other means. Sometimes the problem is a person. Sometimes it is a structure. Sometimes it is a mountain." He understood then, or at least he began to. She didn't see the world in terms of friend or foe, of missions or objectives. She saw it as a system of interlocking physical laws. And she knew how to find the single, critical point in that system where the least amount of effort would produce the most profound result. She was a living, breathing fulcrum. 2 hours later, a new sound intruded upon the silence of the base. It was not the familiar thumping of a standard transport helicopter. It was a high-pitched, almost silent whine. A sleek, black, unmarked aircraft descended from the gray sky, its form seeming to bend the light around it. It landed on the makeshift pad with barely a whisper, its engines idling with a sound like a drawn breath. It had no markings, no insignia. It was as anonymous and untraceable as she was. Anya stood up, her report filed, her pack shouldered. She walked to the hatch, pausing for a moment to look back at Reese. "You have the command, Sergeant," she said. "The geology of the Western Pass is more stable, basalt and granite. You'll have no trouble there." It was her final gift, a piece of critical intelligence, delivered as a simple statement of fact. Then she was gone, a gray shadow slipping out into the frozen twilight. Reese watched on a perimeter camera as she walked across the snow-dusted ground and up the ramp into the waiting aircraft. The ramp closed, the whine of the engines deepened for a moment, and the craft lifted into the air, vanishing into the low clouds as silently as it had arrived. The legend of the frozen canyon was told for years afterward. It became a cautionary tale for arrogant commanders and a lesson in the war colleges on the importance of unconventional thinking. But those who had been there, the men who had stood in that TOC and watched a mountain die on a video screen, they knew the truth. They knew it was not about tactics or strategy. It was about a woman who could read the secret language of the earth, who could listen to the whispers of the wind, and who could solve an impossible problem with a single, perfectly placed piece of metal. She had arrived as a mystery and departed as a myth, leaving behind nothing but an altered landscape and the cold, hard silence of a job well done. She was Voronova, she was Spectre, and for one day, in a place forgotten by the world, she had reminded them all that the most powerful force is not an army, but a mind that can see the flaw in everything.